The supply closet smelled like industrial cleaner and forgotten dreams. I pressed my back against the metal shelving, my hand clamped over my mouth to muffle the sounds escaping my chest. 3 years. 3 years of perfect performance reviews, of arriving first and leaving last, of making myself indispensable to people who couldn't remember my name without checking their calendars. And now this. The termination letter was still warm from the printer, folded into my blazer pocket, like a secret I couldn't bear to look at again. Effective immediately. Position eliminated. No severance. No explanation beyond the corporate language that meant absolutely nothing. I'd given this company everything. I'd reorganized the entire executive filing system. I'd anticipated needs before they were voiced. I'd covered for mistakes that would have cost others their careers, and I'd been erased in the time it took to print a single page. The door to the supply closet opened. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The fluorescent light from the hallway cut across the darkness like a blade, and I saw polished shoes, the kind that cost more than my monthly rent, stop at the threshold. The meeting starts in 4 minutes. The voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never once needed to repeat itself. Callum Vance. Not just a name, a force. The man who'd acquired Hartley and Associates 6 weeks ago in a deal that had made international headlines. The man whose signature had just appeared at the bottom of my termination letter. I should have apologized. Should have scrambled out of that closet with some excuse about checking inventory. Should have done anything other than what I actually did. I laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was the sound that escapes when everything inside you breaks at once and there's nowhere for the pieces to go. Your meeting, I said, still pressed against those shelves in the dark, is the least of my concerns right now, Mr. Vance. Silence. Then the door opened wider, and he stepped inside. The thing about supply closets is that they're not designed for two people, especially not when one of those people commands a net worth that Forbes estimates at $4.7 billion and the other has mascara running down her face and a termination letter in her pocket. He didn't turn on the light, just stood there in the darkness with me, close enough that I could smell cedar and something citrus, something that probably cost more per ounce than my entire wardrobe. You're Nora Whitfield. It wasn't a question. I didn't know how he knew my name. We'd never spoken directly, never been in the same room, longer than it took for me to hand off documents to his assistant. I was Nora Whitfield, I corrected, my voice steadier than it had any right to be. As of 20 minutes ago, I'm nobody at all. Another pause. In the thin light bleeding through the door's edge, I could see the sharp line of his jaw, the controlled stillness of his posture. Callum Vance was 41 years old, and he moved through the world like someone who had never once doubted his place in it. Who signed your termination? You did. I didn't. 3 words. 3 words that stopped my spiraling thoughts cold. The letterhead was yours, I said slowly. Your signature? I haven't signed a single termination order since the acquisition. That wasn't part of my transition plan. I stared at him, or tried to, in the darkness. Then who? The door swung open again, flooding us both with light. Regina Ashworth, the VP of Operations, and the woman who had handed me that letter, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, stood frozen in the doorway. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, recognition, and then something that looked very much like fear. Mr. Vance. Her voice was too bright. The board is waiting. I was just... Ms. Whitfield won't be terminated. Regina's mouth opened, closed. I'm sorry. Callum Vance stepped out of the supply closet, adjusting his cuff with the casual precision of a man who had never been caught off guard in his life. I said she won't be terminated. In fact, effective immediately, she'll be transferred to my personal staff. He turned back to look at me, still standing there with tear tracks on my face and confusion in my eyes. Meet me in my office in 1 hour, Ms. Whitfield. We have a great deal to discuss. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hallway toward the boardroom, leaving Regina and me staring at each other across a threshold that had suddenly become a battle line. This isn't over, Regina said quietly. Whatever you think just happened. I don't think anything happened, I replied, finding my voice at last. I know exactly what happened. You tried to fire me using a forged signature, and the men whose signature you forged just found out. I walked past her, my shoulder brushing hers, as I moved toward the elevators. I had 1 hour to pull myself together, 1 hour to figure out what Callum Vance actually wanted, and 1 hour to decide whether I was walking into an opportunity or a trap. Let me tell you something about myself, because you'll need to understand where I came from, to understand why I made the choices I did. I grew up in Belhaven, a town so small that when my mother's addiction became public knowledge, every person I passed on the street knew about it before I did. I was 12 when social services came, 14 when I aged out of the group home I'd been placed in, 18 when I put myself through community college by working 3 jobs, waitressing, cleaning offices, and tutoring high schoolers who had more resources in their backpacks than I'd had in my entire childhood. I learned early that the world doesn't owe you anything. Not fairness, not compassion, not even acknowledgement. What the world does respond to is competence, excellence, the quiet, relentless refusal to disappear. So, that's what I became. Excellent, indispensable. The person who anticipated problems before they arose, who solved crises before they became emergencies, who made herself so valuable that no one could afford to let her go. Until Regina Ashworth decided that I'd seen too much. I understood now why she'd done it. 3 weeks ago, I'd walked into the wrong conference room at the wrong time and witnessed her shredding documents that should have been preserved for the acquisition audit. I hadn't said anything, hadn't even acknowledged what I'd seen, but she'd known that I knew, and that was enough. The termination wasn't about budget cuts or position elimination. It was about silencing a witness. And now Callum Vance had unknowingly stepped into the middle of it. His office occupied the entire 52nd floor of the Hartley Tower, a space that had been stripped of its previous occupant's personality and replaced with something stark, intentional, and quietly overwhelming. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sprawling skyline of Port Aurelian, the old-money coastal city that served as the headquarters for half the financial institutions in the country. The furniture was minimal, a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian, 2 leather chairs, and nothing else. No photographs, no personal touches, just clean lines and controlled space. Callum Vance stood at the window, his back to me, watching the city below with the expression of someone calculating its value. Close the door, I did. Sit. I didn't. He turned then, one eyebrow slightly raised. It was the most emotion I'd seen on his face since the supply closet. You're not afraid of me, he observed. Should I be? Most people are. Most people haven't spent the last hour realizing that their entire career was almost destroyed by a woman covering up document fraud. Fear is a luxury I can't afford right now. Something shifted in his expression. Interest, maybe, or recognition. Tell me about the documents. So I did. I told him about the conference room, the shredder, the panicked look on Regina's face when she turned and seen me standing there. I told him about the weeks of small cruelties that followed, the missed meeting invitations, the lost files, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. I told him everything except the one thing I was still trying to figure out: why he cared. You could have reported this when it happened, he said when I finished. Why didn't you? Because I had no proof. My word against a vice president's. And I needed this job. And now? Now I have even less proof. The documents are gone. The only evidence is a forged termination letter with your signature on it. Callum Vance moved away from the window, crossing to his desk where a single file folder sat waiting. The documents weren't destroyed, he said. They were moved. Ms. Ashworth made digital copies before she shredded the originals. She's been using them to leverage her position during the transition. He opened the folder and slid it across the desk toward me. This is what she was hiding. I picked up the folder, read the first page, then the second. By the third page, my hands were shaking. It wasn't just document fraud. It was systematic embezzlement spanning nearly a decade. Accounts that had been quietly drained and refilled. Payments to shell companies that didn't exist. A paper trail that led directly to the previous CEO and to Regina Ashworth, who had been his assistant before her meteoric rise to VP. How did you get this? I asked. I didn't. You did. I looked up at him, confused. 3 weeks ago, he continued, my forensic accountants flagged anomalies in the Hartley records. They couldn't locate the source documents to verify the discrepancies. Yesterday, they received an anonymous tip suggesting that a low-level administrative employee had witnessed document destruction and might be able to identify which files were missing. The anonymous tip, the perfectly timed termination, the supply closet. You knew, I said slowly. You knew she was going to fire me. You were waiting. I was positioned to intervene should the opportunity arise. You used me as bait. I gave you a chance to be more than a victim. The words hit harder than they should have. Because he wasn't wrong. I'd spent my entire career making myself useful to people who never saw me. Here was someone who'd seen me from the beginning, seen my value, my vulnerability, and my potential, and made a calculated decision to let events unfold. It should have made me angry. Instead, it made me feel something far more dangerous. Seen. What do you want from me, Mr. Vance? He sat down in the chair behind his desk, folding his hands in front of him with the deliberate precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. I want you to help me dismantle everything Regina Ashworth has built. I want you to be my eyes and ears in this company while I root out everyone connected to the embezzlement scheme. And when it's over, when the truth has been exposed and the responsible parties held accountable, I want to offer you a permanent position on my executive team. Why me? Because you've survived things that would have broken lesser people, and you've done it without compromising your integrity. Because you see details that others miss. Because you're smart enough to know when to stay silent and brave enough to speak when it matters. He paused, holding my gaze with an intensity that made the air feel thin. And because I've been watching you for 6 weeks, Ms. Whitfield, You're the only person in this building I trust. If you're listening to this story, I want you to pause for just a moment. Think about a time when someone finally saw you, not the version of yourself you present to the world, but the real you underneath, the person you've built from scratch, through pain and persistence, and the quiet refusal to give up. That's what it felt like, standing in Callum Vance's office, like being recognized for the first time. If you're with Mr. Douglas Tales, comment, tell us where you're watching from. I accepted his offer, not because I trusted him. Trust, I'd learned, was something you earned over time, not something you granted based on impressive speeches in corner offices. I accepted because the alternative was worse, because Regina Ashworth had tried to destroy me, and the only way out was through. And maybe, if I'm being honest, because part of me wanted to see what would happen next. Callum Vance's personal staff operated out of a suite on the 51st floor, accessible only by a private elevator that required both a keycard and a biometric scan. There were 4 other people on the team. His executive assistant, a woman named Mira, who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. His head of security, a former military contractor named Theo, whose presence made rooms feel smaller. His personal attorney, Julian, who looked like he'd stepped out of a courtroom drama and never quite stepped back. And his financial analyst, a man named David, whose genius was apparently exceeded only by his social awkwardness. "You're the new one," David said when I was introduced. "The supply closet girl." "That's not my preferred title." "It's what everyone's calling you. You're already a legend. The woman who made Callum Vance miss a board meeting." I glanced at Mira, who confirmed with a slight nod. He was 14 minutes late. In 3 years of working for him, I've never seen him late to anything. He was offering me a job. He was choosing you over a room full of people who control billions of dollars in investment capital. Mira's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was something underneath it. Curiosity, maybe, or warning. Don't underestimate what that means. I didn't. That was the problem. My first week on Callum's team was a masterclass in the difference between corporate work and the work that actually mattered. At Hartley, I'd spent my days managing calendars, organizing files, and making sure executives had everything they needed to look competent in meetings they rarely prepared for. It was important work, the kind that kept the machine running, but it was invisible, replaceable, the kind of work that people noticed only when it wasn't done. On Callum's team, everything was different. "I need a full analysis of Regina Ashworth's career trajectory," he said during my first briefing. "Every position she's held, every project she's led, every person she's worked closely with. I want to know who she trusts, who she's betrayed, and who might be motivated to betray her." That's comprehensive. That's necessary. We're not just trying to catch a thief, Ms. Whitfield. We're trying to map a network. Regina didn't build this scheme alone, and she didn't hide it this long, without help. So I became an archaeologist of corporate history, digging through years of personnel files, performance reviews, and organizational charts. I tracked patterns in promotions and terminations, identified clusters of employees who move between departments in suspicious synchronization, and built a timeline of the embezzlement that revealed not just what had been stolen, but how the theft had been disguised. It was meticulous, exhausting work, and I was good at it. You have an interesting mind, Callum said one evening, reviewing my latest report in his office while the city lights glittered behind him. Most people look for evidence. You look for absence of evidence. The things that should be there, but aren't. That's how you survive when you grow up without resources, I said. You learn to notice what's missing. He set the report down, studying me with that unsettling intensity that seemed to be his default mode. Tell me about Belhaven. The question caught me off guard. I'd mentioned the town exactly once, in passing, when explaining how I'd developed my organizational skills. I hadn't expected him to remember. There's not much to tell. There's always much to tell. People just choose not to. And you're asking me to choose differently? I'm asking you to trust me with something real. It wasn't a fair request. He was my employer. Our relationship was professional, transactional, bounded by the work we were doing together. I had no obligation to share my history with him, but there was something in the way he asked. Something that suggested he wasn't just collecting information, he was trying to understand. So I told him. I told him about my mother's pills, about the day I came home from school to find her unconscious on the kitchen floor, about the foster homes, the group home, the endless parade of adults who saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped, about the nights I'd slept in the library because it was the only place that felt safe. I told him about working my way through college, about the professors who believed in me and the ones who didn't, about the first time I put on professional clothes and walked into an office building and thought, this is how I survive. I told him everything except the fear, the constant underlying terror that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how far I climbed, I was always one mistake away from losing it all. That fear I kept for myself. When I finished, Callum was quiet for a long moment. The city pulsed beyond the windows, millions of lives moving through the night, and we sat in that silence, like two people who had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. My father built his empire by destroying people, he said finally. He didn't care about innovation or progress or creating value. He cared about winning, and winning, for him, meant making sure everyone else lost. He stood, moving to the window, his silhouette dark against the city's glow. I inherited everything he built, the money, the companies, the reputation. What I didn't inherit was his conscience, or his lack of one. I've spent the last 15 years trying to prove that you can succeed without being a monster. That power doesn't have to corrupt absolutely. Has it worked? I don't know. He turned to look at me. Some days I think I've made a difference. Other days I think I'm just a different kind of monster, wearing better clothes. You're not a monster. You don't know me well enough to say that. I know you could have let Regina fire me. You could have stayed out of it, protected your acquisition, avoided the complication. Instead, you walked into a supply closet and offered me a lifeline. Maybe I just needed your skills. Maybe, but that's not why you did it. Another silence. This one felt different, charged, uncertain, like the moment before a storm breaks. Why do you think I did it, Miss Whitfield? Nora, I said, if we're going to keep having conversations like this, you should probably call me Nora. Nora. He said my name like he was testing how it felt. Why do you think I intervened? Because you recognize something, I said slowly, working through the thought as I spoke it. You saw someone trying to survive in a world that wasn't built for them, using the only tools they had, and it reminded you of yourself. He didn't confirm or deny it, just stood there in the darkness, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "It's late," he said finally. "You should go home. Get some rest." "Is that an order?" "It's a suggestion, from someone who hasn't taken his own advice in years." I gathered my things, moved toward the door, but something made me stop, turn back. "Mr. Vance?" "Callum, if we're going to keep having conversations like this." "Callum?" His name felt strange in my mouth. Too intimate, too human for the man I'd built up in my mind. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for letting yourself be seen." I left his office that night with something I hadn't felt in years, something dangerous and terrifying and absolutely impossible to ignore. Hope. The investigation accelerated over the following weeks. David's financial analysis revealed that the embezzlement had been remarkably sophisticated, not just skimming money from obvious accounts, but manipulating the timing of transactions, exploiting delays in reconciliation systems, and using the complexity of Hartley's multinational operations to create hiding places that would take months to fully map. "Whoever designed this scheme was a genius," David said during one of our team meetings, sounding almost admiring. "Not Regina. She doesn't have the technical background. Someone with real financial engineering skills was involved at the beginning." "The former CEO?" I suggested. "Maybe. But even he seems more like a beneficiary than an architect. The real mastermind is still hidden." Theo had been running his own investigation, quiet inquiries among Hartley's security staff, interviews with former employees, surveillance of Regina's movements. What he'd found was troubling. "She's been meeting with someone outside the company," he reported, 3 times in the past 2 weeks, always at the same location, a private club on the north end of town. I can't get access to confirm who she's meeting with, but the club is known for catering to a particular clientele. "What kind of clientele?" Callum asked. "The kind that doesn't want to be seen. Politicians, executives, people with enough money to buy anonymity." "Can you get photographs?" "I can try, but if I'm made, we lose any advantage we have." Callum considered this, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in what I was beginning to recognize as his thinking pose. "No surveillance," he decided. "Not yet. We need to draw her out, not chase her into hiding." "How do we do that?" Julian asked. "By making her think she's already won." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Callum would announce publicly that he was satisfied with the acquisition transition and that no further audits were planned. He would praise Regina's work during the integration, positioning her as a key player in Hartley's future, and he would invite her to attend a gala at his estate, an exclusive event that would cement her status as a trusted member of his inner circle. "She's too smart to fall for flattery," I said, when he outlined the strategy. "It's not flattery, it's opportunity. Right now, Regina's operating from fear. Fear of being discovered, fear of losing everything she's built. If I make her feel secure, she'll start to relax, make mistakes, reach out to her accomplices. And the gala? A controlled environment. My security, my guest list, my territory. If she's going to make a move, I want it to happen where I can see it." "What's my role?" Callum was quiet for a moment, studying me with that disconcerting intensity. "I need you to be visible," he said finally. "Not as my employee, as my guest." The implications of that statement hung in the air between us. "You want people to think we're..." Involved. I want Regina to think you're important to me, that whatever you know about her document destruction, whatever evidence you might have, I'm invested in protecting. She'll see you as a threat, and threatened people make desperate choices. So I'm bait again. You're a strategic asset. That's a polished way of saying bait. He didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to something that was almost gentle. I know what I'm asking. I know the risk. If there was another way, there's always another way. You're choosing this one because it's efficient. I'm choosing this one because it plays to our strengths. You're observant, composed under pressure, and Regina already underestimates you. Those are advantages I can't manufacture. And if something goes wrong, then I'll protect you. His voice was flat, absolute, whatever it takes. I should have questioned that promise, should have recognized it for what it was. A commitment that exceeded professional boundaries, that implied something deeper than strategy. Instead, I found myself nodding. What do I wear? Callum's estate sat on 40 acres of manicured grounds overlooking the Aurelian Sound, a body of water so blue it looked artificial. The main house was a study in restraint and excess. Clean architectural lines wrapped around 32 rooms of museum-quality art, imported furnishings, and technology so seamlessly integrated that it was essentially invisible. "This is where you live?" I asked, stepping out of the car that had delivered me for a dress fitting 3 days before the gala. "This is where I host events," Callum corrected. "I live in the East Wing. 3 rooms, minimal furniture. The rest is for appearances. Expensive appearances. The wealthy expect to be impressed. Failing to meet those expectations is its own kind of vulnerability." He led me through the main entrance, a soaring atrium of glass and steel, to a private salon where a team of stylists waited with racks of clothing that looked like they belonged in a museum. "I've taken the liberty of selecting some options," he said, "but the final choice is yours." The options were overwhelming. Gowns in silk and velvet, in colours that ranged from midnight black to rose gold. Each one probably cost more than my annual salary at Hartley. "This is too much," I said. "It's necessary. The women at this gala will be wearing pieces from the current season's collections. You need to match that expectation." "Why?" "Because if you look like you don't belong, Regina will dismiss you. If you look like you do, she'll be forced to take you seriously." It made strategic sense. It also made me deeply uncomfortable. "I'm not some mannequin you can dress up to suit your purposes." "No," he agreed. "You're a formidable woman who has spent her entire life being underestimated because of circumstances beyond her control. This is an opportunity to control how you're perceived. I'm not dressing you up. I'm giving you armor." I looked at the gowns again, at the stylists waiting with patient professionalism, at Callum standing by the door with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The navy one," I said finally, "with the architectural draping." "An excellent choice." He moved to leave, but something made me call after him. "Callum?" He paused. "Why does this matter so much to you? And don't say it's about protecting the acquisition." For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, quietly, "Because I spent the first half of my life watching my father destroy people for profit. And I swore that when I had power, I would use it differently. Regina Ashworth has been stealing from this company for nearly a decade. Not just money, but opportunity. Every dollar she took was a dollar that didn't go to employees who needed it, to projects that could have created value, to the kind of growth that lifts everyone up. She represents everything I've spent my career fighting against. And me? What do I represent? He looked at me, then, really looked, with an intensity that made my breath catch. You represent the possibility that power doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, that someone can survive the worst this world has to offer and still come out the other side with their integrity intact. That's worth protecting, Nora. That's worth everything. Then he was gone, and I was left standing in a room full of beautiful gowns, trying to remember how to breathe. The gala was 3 days away when I found the first cracks in Callum's carefully constructed control. I was working late in the 51st floor offices, a habit I'd developed since joining his team, partly because the work was genuinely pressing, and partly because I wasn't ready to go home to my empty apartment and think about what was happening between us. Nothing was happening. That's what I kept telling myself. This was a professional relationship with professional boundaries. The intensity of our conversations, the way he looked at me sometimes, the warmth in his voice when he said my name, all of it was simply the product of high-stakes circumstances and close quarters. I almost believed it. That night, I heard voices coming from Callum's office. Raised voices, which was unusual. Callum's default was controlled quiet, and I'd never heard him raise his voice in anger. Not your decision to make. A woman's voice, sharp with fury. Everything that happens in my companies is my decision. Callum's voice was cold in a way I hadn't heard before. You've had 3 years to address this situation. You chose inaction. Now I'm choosing differently. She's manipulating you. Can't you see that? This girl appears out of nowhere, claims to have witnessed some convenient crime, and suddenly you're parading her around like... Like what, Vivian? Like she matters. I shouldn't have been listening. The ethical thing would have been to walk away, to come back when the conversation was over. But something in that exchange, the venom in the woman's voice, the defensive edge in Callum's, held me frozen. Nora Whitfield has done more real work in 3 weeks than most of my executive team has done in 3 years. She's earned every opportunity I've given her. She's a secretary, Callum, a nobody from nowhere who's clever enough to see an opportunity and ruthless enough to take it. You don't know anything about her. I know more than you think. I know she grew up in poverty. I know her mother was an addict. I know she spent her entire adult life climbing over whatever obstacles stood in her way. That's not someone you trust. That's someone you watch. The silence that followed was electric. When Callum spoke again, his voice had dropped to something dangerous. Get out! Callum, get out of my office. Get out of my house. And if I ever hear you speak about Nora that way again, you will find that our family connection protects you from far less than you imagine. Footsteps approached the door. I barely had time to flatten myself against the wall before a woman emerged. Tall, blonde, dressed in clothing that screamed old money and entitled fury. She didn't see me as she strode toward the elevator, her heels striking the marble like gunshots. I waited until the elevator doors closed. Then, slowly, I moved to Callum's doorway. He was standing at the window, his back to me, one hand pressed against the glass as if he was trying to hold back the night. How much did you hear? I could have lied, could have pretended I'd just arrived. But we'd made a promise, hadn't we? To trust each other with something real. Enough. He didn't turn around. Vivian is my cousin. She manages certain family assets and has... opinions about how I run my businesses. She thinks I'm a gold digger. She thinks everyone is a gold digger. It's the only framework she understands. Is she right? Now he did turn. His face was composed, but there was something underneath, of vulnerability that I'd only caught glimpses of before. You tell me, he said. Are you using me, Nora? I'm using the opportunity you gave me. I'm using my skills to contribute to work I believe in. If that's using you, then yes. That's not what I mean. I knew what he meant. The question that had been building between us for weeks, never quite spoken aloud. I don't know what this is, I said, honestly. I don't know if it's gratitude or respect or something else. But I know that I didn't plan it, and I'm not trying to manipulate it. Whatever's happening here, it's as confusing for me as it is for you. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I've built my entire life around control, he said quietly. Controlling my businesses, my image, my emotions. It's the only way I know how to function. But you, he shook his head, you make me want to be reckless, and I don't know how to handle that. Then don't handle it. Just be in it, with me. The words hung between us, an invitation I hadn't quite meant to offer. Then his phone buzzed, shattering the moment. He glanced at the screen, and I watched his face transform. Vulnerability replaced by sharp focus in the space of a heartbeat. Theo has something, he said. He's identified the person Regina's been meeting with. Who? My uncle, Victor Vance. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Victor Vance had been Callum's father's younger brother, the black sheep of the family, brilliant but undisciplined, who had been quietly removed from the family business 30 years ago after a series of financial irregularities. He'd disappeared into the shadows of the financial world, surfacing occasionally in connection with deals that were technically legal but ethically questionable. He has the technical expertise, David confirmed after a frantic few hours of research. The embezzlement scheme has his fingerprints all over it, the same patterns he used before, adapted for modern systems. But why? I asked. What's his connection to Hartley? Revenge, Callum said flatly. My father destroyed him, stripped him of his position, his reputation, his access to family resources. Victor's been waiting 30 years for an opportunity to strike back. And Regina? A tool. Victor found someone inside the company with ambition and resentment and pointed her in the right direction. The money she's been stealing, I'd bet half of it has been flowing to accounts he controls. So the gala becomes even more important, Mira said. If Regina knows Victor is involved, she'll be looking for signals from him, instructions. The gala is 3 days away. That's enough time for her to make contact, especially if she thinks she's about to be rewarded for her loyalty. What do we do? Callum's jaw tightened. We watch, we wait, and when they make their move, we'll be ready. The night before the gala, I couldn't sleep. I stood on the small balcony of my apartment, watching the lights of Port Aurelian glitter against the darkness, trying to organize my thoughts into some kind of coherent pattern. Everything was moving so fast. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a secretary. Now I was standing at the center of a conspiracy that involved billions of dollars, family betrayals, and a man whose presence had begun to feel like oxygen. Necessary, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. What did I actually want? Justice, certainly. Regina Ashworth had tried to destroy me, and part of me wanted to watch her fall. But it was more than that. I wanted to prove something to myself, to the world, to everyone who had ever looked at my background and decided I wasn't worth their time. And Callum? What did I want from Callum? The honest answer was complicated. I wanted his respect, which I'd already earned. I wanted his trust, which he'd already given. But beneath that, something deeper stirred. A longing for connection, for someone who saw past the armor I'd built and recognized the person underneath. Was that love? I didn't know. I'd never had the luxury of examining my own emotions this closely. Survival had always come first. Everything else was secondary. But standing on that balcony, watching the city breathe beneath me, I allowed myself to imagine a future where survival wasn't the only thing that mattered. It felt terrifying. It felt like hope. The Vance estate blazed with light. 300 guests filled the grand ballroom, a sea of designer gowns and custom suits swirling around an orchestra, playing something elegant and forgettable. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic shadows across walls hung with art that probably belonged in a museum. Waiters in immaculate livery circulated with champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week. And I stood at the entrance, in my navy gown with the architectural draping, trying to remember that I belonged here. "You look magnificent." Callum appeared at my elbow, impeccable in a tuxedo that had clearly been tailored to his exact specifications. But it wasn't his clothes, I noticed. It was his eyes, which held something warmer than usual as they swept over me. "Thank you. I feel like an imposter." "Good. That means you're paying attention. Everyone here is an imposter in some way. The difference is that most of them don't know it." He offered his arm, and I took it, acutely aware of the warmth of him through the fabric of his sleeve. "Regina?" I asked quietly as we began to move into the crowd. "Arrived 10 minutes ago. She's currently holding court near the east windows, pretending she wasn't hoping to be the first person I spoke to tonight." "And Victor?" "No sign yet, but Theo has people watching every entrance." We made our way through the crowd, and I realized quickly that Callum had been right about the gown. Dressed like this, I wasn't the secretary who'd been crying in a supply closet. I was someone worth noticing. Eyes followed us as we moved, and I caught snippets of whispered conversation. "Who is that with Callum?" "Someone new. She's quite striking." It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like a performance. Necessary, but hollow. "Smile," Callum murmured. "You look like you're marching to battle." "Isn't that what this is?" "It's theatre. The battle comes later." We stopped to accept greetings from a cluster of executives, then moved on to pay respects to an elderly woman who turned out to be one of Callum's major shareholders. Through it all, I played my part, smiling, nodding, offering just enough conversation to seem engaged without revealing anything real. Then, Regina Ashworth approached, and the game shifted entirely. "Mr. Vance?" Her voice was warm, professional, absolutely delighted. "What a wonderful event. You've outdone yourself." "Ms. Ashworth, I'm glad you could join us." I wouldn't have missed it. Her eyes slid to me, and I watched something cold flicker behind her pleasant expression. "And, Ms. Whitfield, what a surprise to see you here." "Is it?" I asked mildly. I was under the impression that Mr. Vance invited his most valued team members. The barb landed precisely as intended. Regina's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Of course. It's just that administrative roles don't usually. But never mind. I'm sure you're learning a great deal in your new position. I am. It's remarkable what you can learn when you start paying attention to the right details. Callum's hand found the small of my back, a subtle gesture of support that sent warmth spreading through me. Nora has been invaluable to the transition, he said smoothly. In fact, I'm considering her for a permanent executive role. Her skills have been revelatory. Something shifted in Regina's face, a flicker of calculation, quickly suppressed. How wonderful. We should catch up properly sometime, Ms. Whitfield. Compare notes on our experiences at Hartley. I'd like that, I lied. She drifted away into the crowd, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. She knows, I said quietly. She knows we're on to her. Good. Threatened people make desperate choices, remember? That's what worries me. The evening progressed in a blur of champagne and calculated conversations. I met more wealthy, powerful people in 3 hours than I had in my entire previous life, and by the time midnight approached, I was exhausted from the effort of maintaining my facade. Then, Theo appeared at Callum's elbow, his face carefully blank. We have a development. Private study, 3 minutes. Callum nodded, then turned to me with an apologetic expression. I need to handle something. Will you be all right? I've survived worse than a room full of rich people. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face, and then he was gone, disappearing through a side door that blended seamlessly into the wall. I was alone. Not truly alone, of course. I was surrounded by 300 of the wealthiest people in the country. But without Callum's presence, I felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable, like a fraud waiting to be discovered. I made my way to the edge of the ballroom, positioning myself near a set of French doors that opened onto a terrace. The night air was cool against my skin, a welcome relief from the stifling warmth inside. You're very good at this. The voice came from behind me, smooth, cultured, with an undertone of something I couldn't quite identify. I turned to find a man leaning against the doorframe, watching me with an expression of amused interest. He was in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished, dressed in a tuxedo that fit him with the ease of long familiarity. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and utterly cold. Victor Vance. It had to be. I'm sorry, I said, keeping my voice neutral. The performance, the transformation from nobody to somebody, it's quite impressive, really. Most people can't pull off that kind of metamorphosis. But you... He tilted his head, studying me like a specimen. You wear it like you were born to it. I don't know what you mean. Of course you do. He moved closer, and I forced myself not to step back. You're the girl from the supply closet, the secretary who caught my partner doing something inconvenient. And now you're here, on my nephew's arm, dressed in couture and pretending you belong. Maybe I do belong. Maybe. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Or maybe you're just a very clever opportunist who's gotten in over her head. If you're trying to intimidate me, Mr. Vance, you'll have to do better than vague insinuations. Will I? He leaned close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp. Let me be direct, then. Whatever you think you know about Hartley's finances, whatever evidence you imagine you've gathered, it won't matter. The people involved in this situation have been playing this game for decades. You're a distraction at best. At worst, you're a liability that will need to be addressed. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. You've wandered into something far bigger than you understand, and your patron, my idealistic nephew, can't protect you from what's coming. Walk away while you still can. And if I don't, his expression hardened, then you'll learn the same lesson everyone eventually learns. Power protects its own, and you, Ms. Whitfield, are not one of us. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as smoothly as he'd appeared. I stood there for a long moment, my hands trembling slightly, my mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. Victor Vance knew exactly what we were doing. He knew, and he wasn't afraid, which meant either he had protections in place that we hadn't anticipated, or he was planning something we hadn't foreseen. I needed to find Callum. The private study was located in the East Wing, accessible through a series of corridors that grew progressively quieter as they moved away from the ballroom. I followed the route Callum had taken, my heels clicking against the marble floors, my mind still reeling from Victor's threats. The door to the study was slightly ajar, and I could hear voices inside. Callum's measured tones, Theo's rough baritone, and a third voice I didn't recognize. I pushed the door open. 3 faces turned toward me. Callum looked surprised. Theo looked concerned. And the third person, a woman I'd never seen before, dressed in the uniform of the catering staff, looked terrified. "Nora," Callum said, "what's wrong?" "Victor was here. He approached me on the terrace. He knows about the investigation, Callum. He knows everything." The room went very still. "He spoke to you directly?" Theo asked. "He threatened me, said I was in over my head, that I should walk away while I still could." Callum's jaw tightened. "Did he say anything specific? Names, dates, details?" "No, just implications. He was testing me, I think, trying to see how much I knew." "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing. I played dumb." "Good." Callum turned to the woman in catering uniform. "This changes the timeline. If Victor knows we're watching, he'll accelerate whatever he's planning." "What's happening?" I asked. "Who is she?" The woman spoke for herself. "My name is Iris. I've been working undercover on Mr. Vance's security team for 6 months. Tonight, I discovered something that changes everything." She held out a phone, its screen displaying a photograph. The image showed documents, contracts, account numbers, signatures. At the top, clearly visible, was a letterhead I recognized, Hartley and Associates. "These are the original embezzlement documents," Iris said. "The ones Regina supposedly destroyed, Victor's, been keeping them as insurance. Leverage in case his partnership with Regina ever went sideways." "Where did you find these?" I asked. "In Regina's hotel room. Victor had them delivered tonight, just before the gala." "Why?" "Because tomorrow morning, he's planning to release them to the press. Not as evidence of embezzlement, as evidence that Callum orchestrated the whole thing." The implications crashed over me like a wave. Victor wasn't trying to cover up the embezzlement. He was trying to frame Callum for it. "That's insane," I said. "Callum wasn't even involved with Hartley until the acquisition." "The documents have been altered," Iris explained. "Dates changed, signatures forged. If these go public without context, it will look like Callum engineered the entire scheme as part of a hostile takeover strategy. He'll be destroyed." "And Victor?" "Victor disappears with the money, protected by lawyers and offshore accounts. Regina takes the fall as his accomplice, and Callum goes down as the mastermind. Everyone involved in the actual crime walks away clean." It was elegant, I realized, horrifyingly elegant. Victor had spent 30 years planning his revenge, and now he was about to execute it perfectly. Unless we stopped him. "Can we intercept the release?" I asked. "Not without revealing our hand," Theo said grimly. "If we go to the press first, we look like we're trying to cover something up. If we wait, the false narrative takes hold before we can correct it." "Then what do we do?" Callum had been silent through this exchange, his face unreadable. Now he spoke, and his voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. "We give Victor exactly what he wants." Everyone stared at him. "We let him release the documents, let him think he's won, and then we destroy him completely." "How?" I asked. "Regina doesn't know that Iris found the documents. She thinks she's protected. If we can get her to confirm Victor's involvement, on record, before the story breaks, we flip the entire narrative. She'll never agree to that. She will if she thinks she's being betrayed." Callum's eyes met mine, and I saw something fierce burning in them. "Tomorrow morning, Regina Ashworth is going to discover that Victor Vance has been planning to make her the scapegoat all along. And when she realizes that the only person who can protect her is me, she'll tell us everything." The hours between midnight and dawn moved with agonizing slowness. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, could barely think about anything except the machinery we'd set in motion. The delicate, dangerous plan that would either expose Victor's conspiracy or destroy Callum entirely. At 6 a.m., Theo called to confirm that the documents had been delivered to Regina's room. At 7, Iris reported that Regina had received a phone call, almost certainly from Victor, giving her final instructions. At 8, news outlets began receiving anonymous tips about explosive revelations concerning Callum Vance and the Hartley acquisition. The clock was ticking. At 9 a.m., I walked into Regina Ashworth's office. She was packing. I could see it in the way her desk had been cleared, the way cardboard boxes were stacked in the corner with carefully neutral labels. She was preparing to run. "Ms. Whitfield." Her voice was pleasant, controlled, revealing nothing. "I didn't expect to see you today." "I imagine not." I closed the door behind me and moved to stand in front of her desk. She watched me with those calculating eyes, her expression perfectly composed. "You should know that security has been alerted to my presence here," I said. "Anything that happens to me will be recorded and investigated." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I'm sure you do." I pulled out my phone and placed it on her desk. "In approximately 2 hours, every major news outlet in the country is going to receive documents suggesting that Callum Vance orchestrated a decade-long embezzlement scheme at Hartley and Associates. The documents are forgeries created by Victor Vance to destroy his nephew and cover his own crimes. When the truth comes out, and it will, everyone associated with those documents will be investigated, prosecuted, and imprisoned." Regina's composure flickered. Victor's planning to let you take the fall, Regina. The evidence trail leads directly to you. The forged signatures, the altered dates, the shell company accounts, all of it points at you, not him. He's been positioning you as the scapegoat since the beginning. That's not true? Then call him. Right now. Ask him directly who's going to prison when this is over. She didn't reach for her phone, didn't move at all, but I watched the certainty drain from her face, replaced by something that looked very much like fear. "He promised me," she said, quietly. He promised we'd both be protected. He lied, the same way he lied to everyone else who trusted him. Victor Vance destroys people, Regina. It's what he does. It's what he's always done. I leaned forward, meeting her eyes. But it doesn't have to end this way. You can still choose differently. How? Give us Victor, on record, under oath, with every detail you can remember about how the scheme operated and who was involved. Do that, and Callum Vance will ensure that you're treated as a cooperating witness, not a criminal mastermind. Why would he do that? Because he's not his uncle. He's not his father. He actually believes that people can change, that justice means more than revenge. I paused, and because I asked him to. Regina stared at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, she laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. You really believe that, don't you? That Callum Vance is some kind of hero? I believe he's trying to be something better than what he inherited. That's more than most people ever attempt. And what are you trying to be, Miss Whitfield? The loyal secretary who saves the day? The love interest who softens the billionaire's heart? I'm trying to be someone who does the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it would be easier to walk away. Silence stretched between us. Outside the window, the city continued its oblivious churning. Cars, pedestrians, commerce, life. All of it disconnected from the drama unfolding in this small, ordinary office. Finally, Regina spoke. What do you need me to do? The confession took 3 hours. Regina talked and we recorded every word. She told us about Victor's initial approach, his promises of wealth and protection, his careful manipulation of her ambition and resentment. She told us about the embezzlement infrastructure, the shell companies, the falsified records, the elaborate system of delays and obfuscations that had kept the theft hidden for nearly a decade. She told us about the forged documents, created specifically to frame Callum if the scheme ever unraveled. And she told us about the others. The embezzlement had tentacles reaching throughout Hartley's leadership structure. A CFO who had looked the other way, a board member who had received kickbacks, an entire network of complicity that had allowed Victor's scheme to flourish unchallenged. When she finished, Julian took over, guiding her through the legal implications, explaining the cooperation agreement that would protect her from the worst consequences in exchange for her testimony. I stepped outside into the hallway, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of what we'd accomplished. Callum found me there, leaning against the wall with my eyes closed. It's done, I said. She's giving you everything. I heard. What happens now? Now we go to the press. Not with Victor's fabrication, with the truth. Every document, every confession, every piece of evidence we've gathered. We burn his entire conspiracy to the ground before he even realizes what's happening. I opened my eyes, found him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And Victor himself? Theo's people are moving on his location as we speak. He'll be taken into custody within the hour. So it's over. It's over. But there was something in his voice, something that suggested the end of one battle was only the beginning of another. What aren't you telling me? He was quiet for a moment. Then, Victor wasn't working alone. The network Regina described, it's bigger than we anticipated. Dismantling it will take months, possibly years, and there's no guarantee that everyone involved will be held accountable. But we won. We won this round. There will be others. He moved closer, and I became acutely aware of how small the hallway was, how close he was standing. Nora, what you did in there? I did what needed to be done. You did more than that. You gave Regina a chance to choose differently. Most people would have wanted to see her punished, not offered redemption. Most people haven't spent their lives being offered second chances by strangers who had no reason to care. His hand found mine, warm, solid, real. I care. 3 words, 2 syllables each, but they hit me with the force of a revelation. Callum, you don't have to say anything. I know this is complicated. I know the timing is impossible. I know there are 100 reasons why this is a terrible idea. But I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't gratitude or obligation or strategic convenience. He stopped, searching for words. It's the first real thing I've felt in years. I looked at him, this brilliant, damaged man who had given me everything and asked for nothing in return. And I let myself say what I'd been afraid to acknowledge. I feel it too. The press conference was held at noon in the grand lobby of the Hartley Tower. Callum stood at a podium bearing his company's logo, flanked by lawyers and communication staff, facing a sea of journalists and cameras. Behind him, screens displayed the evidence: Regina's confession, the forged documents, the financial records that proved Victor's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. I watched from the edge of the crowd, positioned where I could see, without being seen. 6 weeks ago, Callum began, his voice calm and measured, I acquired Hartley and Associates because I believed in its potential. What I didn't know, what no one outside a small circle of conspirators knew, was that Hartley had been the target of systematic embezzlement for nearly a decade. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The architect of this scheme was Victor Vance, my uncle, aided by several members of Hartley's executive team. Their crimes were not only financial, they were designed to frame innocent people for their actions and to destroy anyone who got in their way. The evidence rolled across the screens: account records, email exchanges, recorded confessions. Every piece of the puzzle we'd assembled over the past weeks laid out in damning detail. This morning, Callum continued, Victor Vance was taken into custody by federal authorities. Several of his accomplices have already agreed to cooperate with the investigation. The remaining perpetrators will be identified and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Questions erupted from the press corps, a chaos of shouted demands and waving hands. Callum fielded them with the practiced ease of someone who had been facing hostile audiences his entire adult life. But I noticed something the cameras didn't capture: the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped the podium, the tightness around his eyes that suggested exhaustion rather than triumph. He was holding himself together by sheer force of will, and I was the only one who could see the cracks. The aftermath was everything we'd anticipated and more. The story dominated news cycles for weeks. Victor's arrest made international headlines. Former Hartley executives were paraded in front of cameras, their carefully constructed images crumbling under the weight of evidence. Financial. Regulators launched investigations. Shareholders filed lawsuits. The entire corporate governance structure of multiple companies came under scrutiny. Through it all, Callum worked with tireless intensity, meeting with investigators, coordinating with lawyers, managing the communications strategy that would determine whether his reputation survived the association with his uncle's crimes. I worked alongside him, handling the organizational chaos with the same attention to detail I'd brought to my secretary work at Hartley. But now, the stakes were infinitely higher, and so was the pressure. "You need to rest," I said one evening, finding him still at his desk at nearly midnight. "You've been going for 18 hours. There's too much to do. There will still be too much to do tomorrow. Running yourself into the ground won't help anyone." He looked up at me, and I saw the exhaustion written in every line of his face. "I keep thinking about all the people who were hurt, the employees whose salaries were constrained because money was being stolen, the investors who trusted Hartley with their futures, the careers that were destroyed because Victor and Regina needed scapegoats. You didn't do those things. I'm the one who inherited the wealth that came from my family's sins. I'm the one who has to make it right. Making it right doesn't mean destroying yourself in the process." I moved around his desk, placed my hands on his shoulders, felt the tension coiled in his muscles. "You've done everything you can. The investigation is proceeding. The guilty parties are being held accountable. At some point, you have to trust the process and let yourself recover." "I don't know how to do that." "I know." I leaned down, pressed my forehead against his. "But you're not alone anymore. Let me help you carry this." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, his arms came up to wrap around me, pulling me close with a desperation that made my heart ache. "I don't deserve you," he said against my hair. "That's not how it works. We don't deserve each other. We choose each other." "Is that what this is? A choice? The only one that matters?" 3 weeks after the press conference, everything fell apart. It started with an interview. A financial journalist named Patricia Keane had been granted access to Regina Ashworth as part of a profile on the women caught in Victor Vance's web. The interview was supposed to be a sympathetic exploration of how an ambitious executive had been manipulated by a master criminal. What it became was something else entirely. "The embezzlement was Victor's idea," Regina said on camera, her voice carefully controlled. "But I wasn't the only one who knew about it. Callum's father was involved from the beginning." I was watching the broadcast in real time when those words hit. I saw Callum's face go pale, saw his hand tighten around the remote control. "That's not possible," he said quietly. "My father died 8 years ago. The embezzlement scheme only started being visible 8 years ago," David corrected, pulling up files on his laptop. "But if the foundations were laid earlier, if your father helped Victor design the original infrastructure—" "No." Callum's voice was flat. "Absolute. My father was many things, but he wasn't a thief." "Callum, he wasn't." But there was something in his eyes, a desperate certainty that I recognized all too well. The look of someone who needed something to be true, regardless of evidence. The investigation that followed was brutal. Forensic accountants poured through decades of Vance family financial records. Lawyers deposed anyone who had ever worked with Callum's father. Journalists dug through archives of corporate history, searching for any connection between the late Harrison Vance and his brother's criminal enterprise. What they found was complicated. Harrison Vance hadn't participated in the embezzlement directly, but he had known about it. He had helped Victor establish the shell company structure that made the theft possible. And he had protected his brother from consequences for as long as he lived. The reason became clear through old emails and personal correspondence that surfaced during the investigation. Harrison had been trying to manage Victor, to keep him under control. He'd seen his brother's tendency toward financial manipulation and had tried to channel it in ways that minimized harm. It hadn't worked. Victor had gone rogue years ago, expanding the scheme far beyond anything Harrison had anticipated, and Harrison had died before he could stop it. "Your father was trying to protect you," I said gently, sitting with Callum in his darkened office. He knew what Victor was capable of, and he was trying to contain the damage. By becoming complicit in theft? By making impossible choices in impossible situations, the same thing all of us do when the people we love are dangerous. Callum was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "I built my entire identity around being different from my father, around proving that the Vance name could stand for something better. And now," he laughed bitterly, "now I find out that even my rebellion was based on a lie. He wasn't the villain I thought he was. He was just a man trying to hold a broken family together." "That doesn't change what you've done, what you're still doing, doesn't it? I've spent 15 years running from a ghost, building businesses to prove I was nothing like him. And now I find out he was protecting me all along, from Victor, from the truth, from the consequences of choices I never knew he made." He looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in his eyes before: complete and utter devastation. "How do I move forward from this, Nora? How do I be the person I was trying to be when that person was built on a foundation of lies?" I didn't have an answer, so instead I did the only thing I could. I sat with him in the darkness, my hand in his, and let the silence hold us both. That was the lowest night, but it wasn't the end. Recovery came slowly, like sunrise after the longest night. The revelation about Harrison Vance dominated headlines for weeks, but gradually the narrative shifted. People began to see the complexity of the story, a family caught in patterns of dysfunction across generations, one son trying to manage the chaos and another exploiting it. And they began to see Callum clearly, not as a hypocrite who had been hiding family secrets, but as someone who had genuinely not known, who had been fighting against something without understanding its full scope. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Vivian, Callum's cousin, the same woman who had called me a gold digger the night of the gala, requested a private meeting. I went with him, partly out of curiosity and partly because I didn't trust her. We met at a private club in the financial district, in a room that looked like it hadn't been redecorated since the 19th century. Vivian was already seated when we arrived, looking older than she had at the party, as if the weight of recent revelations had settled into her bones. "I owe you an apology," she said, without preamble. "Both of you." Callum's expression didn't change. "Go on." "I knew about Harrison's involvement with Victor, not the details. No one knew the details except Victor himself, but I knew there was an arrangement. I thought it was family business, something to be managed quietly, contained. I never imagined it would explode like this." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because Harrison asked me not to. He wanted to protect you from the knowledge, the same way he protected you from Victor. He thought if you didn't know, you couldn't be implicated. Instead, the ignorance nearly destroyed me." "Yes." Vivian's voice was quiet. "I've spent the past weeks realizing how many mistakes I made, how much harm I caused by following Harrison's wishes instead of trusting you with the truth." She turned to me then, and I saw something in her eyes that looked almost like respect. "And you, Ms. Whitfield, I judged you without knowing you. I assumed you were another opportunist, another person trying to profit from my family's dysfunction. Instead, you've been the one holding Callum together through all of this." She paused. "I'm sorry." I didn't know how to respond. Vivian's hostility had been one of the consistent challenges of the past weeks. Her skepticism, a constant reminder that not everyone saw me the way Callum did. "Thank you," I said finally. "That means more than you know." Vivian nodded, then turned back to Callum. "There's something else. Something I came here to offer." "What?" "The family archives. Every document Harrison kept. Every piece of evidence he gathered about Victor's activities over the years. He was building a case, Callum. Slowly, carefully, waiting for the right moment to bring Victor down without destroying everything else in the process. He died before he could use it. Yes, but the evidence still exists, and with it, you might be able to finish what he started. The archives were stored in a vault beneath the Vance family estate, a repository of secrets spanning 3 generations. When we finally gained access, what we found exceeded our most optimistic expectations. Harrison Vance hadn't just been tracking Victor's criminal activities, he'd been documenting everything: bank accounts, co-conspirators, the flow of stolen funds through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. He'd assembled evidence that the current investigation hadn't even begun to uncover. "This changes everything," Julian said, paging through documents with barely contained excitement. "With this material, we can trace the embezzlement back to its origins, identify every person who was involved, recover funds that were written off as unrecoverable years ago." "How long will that take?" "Months, maybe years, but the outcome isn't in question anymore. We have everything we need to dismantle Victor's entire network." I watched Callum as he processed this information, watched the tension in his shoulders gradually ease, the weight of guilt and uncertainty lifting as he realized what his father had left him. Not a legacy of crime, a legacy of attempted justice, incomplete and flawed, but fundamentally good. "He was trying to make it right," Callum said quietly. "All those years, I thought he was just another corrupt billionaire, profiting from other people's suffering. He was actually trying to stop it." "He was trying to protect you," I corrected gently. "The way you've been trying to protect everyone else. It's a family trait, apparently. This obsessive need to carry the world alone." He looked at me then, and something in his expression shifted. Not recovery, that would take much longer, but the beginning of acceptance. "I don't want to carry it alone anymore." "Good, because you don't have to." The months that followed were a study in transformation. With Harrison's archives and Regina's cooperation, the investigation expanded far beyond anything we'd initially imagined. Victor's network turned out to include not just Hartley executives, but partners at major accounting firms, officials at regulatory agencies, and executives at half a dozen other companies that had been quietly compromised over the years. The prosecutions alone generated thousands of pages of court documents. Asset recovery proceedings returned hundreds of millions of dollars to defrauded shareholders. Corporate governance reforms were implemented at companies throughout the industry. And through it all, I worked alongside Callum, no longer as his investigator or his strategic asset, but as his partner. The relationship had shifted so gradually that I couldn't identify the exact moment when it changed. One day, I was his employee, trusted but bounded by professional distance. Then I was his confidant, sharing meals and conversations that stretched long into the night. Then I was staying at his apartment, then living there, then planning a future that I'd never dared to imagine. "I want to introduce you to someone," Callum said one evening, 6 months after the press conference that had started everything. "Who?" "My mother." I'd heard about Eleanor Vance, of course. She'd been divorced from Harrison for 20 years, living quietly in the Pacific Northwest, distancing herself from the family drama that she'd never wanted any part of. "She wants to meet you. She's heard about you. From Vivian, from the press coverage, from me." He paused. "She says she wants to meet the woman who taught her son how to trust again." I felt the weight of those words settle into me. Trust, the thing I'd spent my whole life struggling to offer or receive. "When?" "Next weekend. I've already arranged the flights. First class, obviously." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Unless you prefer coach." "Don't even joke about that." Eleanor Vance lived in a modest house on 3 acres of forested land, about an hour from Seattle. Modest by Vance standards, anyway. It was still larger and more beautiful than anywhere I'd ever lived before Callum. She met us at the door, a woman in her late 60s, with Callum's eyes and an expression of warm curiosity that immediately put me at ease. "So you're Nora," she said, taking both my hands in hers. "I've been looking forward to this." "So have I, Mrs. Vance." "Eleanor, please. I gave up the Vance name decades ago. Too much baggage." She released my hands and turned to Callum, pulling him into a hug that he accepted with visible relief. "You look tired." "I am tired." "Then stay, both of you, as long as you need." We stayed for 5 days. It was the closest thing to a vacation I'd ever experienced. Long walks through rain-soaked forests, evenings by the fire, conversations that ranged from political philosophy to childhood memories to hopes for the future. Eleanor told me stories about Callum as a child, shy, intense, determined to understand everything about the world around him. Callum told stories about his mother, her quiet rebellion against the Vance family expectations, her decision to leave when she realized she couldn't change Harrison. And I told my own stories, about Belhaven, about my mother, about the group home and the library, and the slow, painful process of building a life from nothing. Eleanor listened to all of it without judgment, without pity. When I finished, she simply nodded. "You're a survivor," she said. "That is not a small thing. Neither is choosing to start over. What you did, leaving everything behind, that took courage." "It took desperation," she corrected gently. "I was drowning in that family's dysfunction. Leaving was the only way I knew how to breathe." "And you never regretted it?" "I regretted being away from Callum. Every day, for years. But staying would have destroyed us both. Me slowly, him completely. Sometimes survival means choosing between bad options." I thought about my own choices, the compromises I'd made, the dreams I'd deferred, the walls I'd built to protect myself from disappointment. "How do you know when it's safe to stop surviving?" I asked. "When can you actually start living?" Eleanor smiled, a warm, knowing smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "When you find people who make you want to risk it. When the possibility of joy becomes more compelling than the certainty of safety." She glanced toward the kitchen, where Callum was making tea, his movements easy and unhurried. "When you look at someone and realize you'd rather build something fragile and beautiful than stay forever protected and alone." On the last night of our visit, Callum and I walked through the forest behind Eleanor's house. The rain had stopped, and the trees were dripping with diamond-bright water, catching the last light of sunset. "My mother likes you," he said. "I like her too. She told me something this afternoon, something she's never said to anyone else." "What?" He stopped walking, turned to face me. In the golden light, his features were soft, vulnerable, nothing like the controlled billionaire I'd first encountered in that supply closet. "She said that loving my father nearly destroyed her, that she spent years after the divorce wondering if she'd ever be able to trust anyone again." He paused. "And she said that watching me with you, she finally understood that it was possible, that love could be something other than a battlefield." My heart was pounding. "Callum, I'm not asking you to marry me, not yet, but I need you to know that this isn't temporary for me. You're not an episode in my life, or a phase I'm going through, or someone I'll eventually move past. You're—" He searched for words. "You're where I want to be. Always." I thought about everything we'd been through. The supply closet, the investigation, the galas, and the press conferences, and the long nights piecing together evidence and truth. I thought about holding his hand in the darkness, while he learned that everything he believed about his father was wrong. I thought about fear and hope, and the impossible choice between safety and joy. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Not now. Not ever. You're stuck with me, Callum Vance." He kissed me then, soft, slow, certain, and the forest held its breath around us. The trial of Victor Vance began 14 months after his arrest. It was the most anticipated corporate criminal trial in decades, a convergence of financial intrigue, family drama, and systemic corruption that captured public attention in a way few cases ever did. The courthouse was surrounded by media every day. Legal experts debated strategy on 24-hour news channels. Social media buzzed with theories, accusations, and amateur investigations. And at the center of it all sat Victor Vance, older, greyer, diminished by months of pre-trial detention, but still possessing the cold intelligence that had made him so dangerous. I was called to testify on the third day. The experience was nothing like I'd expected. I'd prepared exhaustively, reviewing every document I'd helped analyze, rehearsing my answers to questions the prosecution anticipated. But nothing could prepare me for the reality of sitting in that witness box, facing a room full of strangers who were hanging on my every word. "Ms. Whitfield," the prosecutor began, "can you describe the circumstances under which you first became aware of potential financial irregularities at Hartley and Associates?" I told them everything: the supply closet, Regina's shredding, the termination letter with the forged signature, Callum's intervention, and the investigation that followed. The defense attorney tried to undermine my credibility, suggesting that I'd fabricated the document destruction to ingratiate myself with Callum. I responded with calm precision, citing specific dates, documents, and corroborating witnesses. "You've developed a personal relationship with Callum Vance during this process," the attorney said, making the word personal sound like an accusation. "Isn't it possible that your testimony is colored by your desire to protect someone you care about?" "My testimony is colored by the truth," I replied. "Mr. Vance and I didn't become involved until months after the facts I'm testifying about. And regardless of our relationship, the evidence speaks for itself, as you well know." The courtroom stirred. Even the judge seemed impressed. When I finished, I left the witness box and walked past the defense table, where Victor Vance sat watching me with those cold, calculating eyes. "Nicely done," he said quietly, too low for anyone else to hear. "You're quite the performer." I didn't respond, didn't even slow down. But I held his gaze for just long enough to let him see that I wasn't afraid anymore. The trial lasted 6 weeks. When it ended, Victor Vance was convicted on 47 counts of fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. His sentence, 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Regina Ashworth, as agreed, was treated as a cooperating witness. She received 5 years of supervised probation and a lifetime ban from financial services. The others, the accountants, the executives, the enablers who had looked the other way, faced their own reckoning. Some pleaded guilty, some fought and lost. A few managed to escape prosecution entirely, protected by lawyers and legal technicalities. But the network was broken. The stolen money was being recovered, and Callum Vance had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that he was nothing like his uncle. The night after the verdict, we celebrated. Not with champagne or a gala, or any of the performative displays of wealth that had once defined Callum's public life. Instead, we ordered takeout, opened a bottle of wine that cost less than most of his shirts, and sat together on the balcony of his apartment, watching the lights of Port Aurelian glitter beneath us. "It's over," I said. "Really, finally over." "This part is over," he corrected. "There's still the civil litigation, the regulatory proceedings, the restructuring of about 15 different companies. Let Julian and David handle the details. Tonight, we're just going to exist." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his face, and pulled me closer. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Of course you could have. You had lawyers and accountants and investigators. I was just organizational support." "You were everything." His voice was soft, serious. "Not just what you did, what you are. Your integrity, your compassion, your stubborn refusal to let me become the worst version of myself." "That's not me. That's just who you were trying to be all along." "Maybe, but I wouldn't have found my way there without someone showing me it was possible." We sat in comfortable silence, the city humming beneath us, the future stretching out ahead like an open road. "What happens now?" I asked eventually. "Whatever we want." He turned to look at me, his eyes reflecting the city lights. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to prove something. To my father's ghost, to the world, to myself. I don't need to prove anything anymore. So what do you want?" "This. Us. A life that's about more than work and obligation and inherited guilt." He paused. "I want to build something good, Nora. Not just in business, in all of it. With you." I thought about the journey that had brought us here. The supply closet and the supply closet moment. That tiny, cramped space where my old life had ended and this one had begun. All the fear and hope and uncertainty that had followed. All of it had led to this. Sitting on a balcony with someone who saw me, truly saw me, and loved what he found. "Then let's build it," I said, "together." 2 years later, I stood in the lobby of Hartley Tower, now renamed Vance Hartley, and watched the dedication ceremony for the Whitfield Education Foundation. The foundation was Callum's idea, a way to channel the recovered embezzlement funds into something meaningful. Scholarships for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, job training programs, support services for young people aging out of foster care. "You're sure about this?" I'd asked when he first proposed it. "Naming it after me?" Who else would I name it after? You're the one who showed me that background doesn't determine destiny, that people can overcome anything if they're given the right opportunities. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just survived. That's exactly what makes it extraordinary. Now, watching the ribbon being cut on a program that would help thousands of young people, like the one I'd been, I finally understood what he meant. Survival wasn't just endurance, it was transformation, taking everything the world threw at you and using it to build something better. Callum appeared at my side, slipping his hand into mine. Ready? I looked at him. This man who had started as my unexpected saviour and become my partner in everything, who had seen me at my lowest and never once treated me as less than I was. Ready? We walked together toward the stage, where a crowd of donors, students, and community members waited. A crowd that included Eleanor Vance, Mira, Theo, David, Julian, all the people who had become family over the past 2 years, and Regina Ashworth. She was there too, working now as a consultant for corporate ethics programs, trying to rebuild a life from the ruins of the one she'd destroyed. I'd resisted, including her at first, but Callum had convinced me. Everyone deserves a second chance, he'd said, even the people who don't seem to deserve it. I wasn't sure I agreed, but I was learning that grace didn't require agreement, just willingness. The speech I gave that day was short. I'd never been comfortable with public speaking, and the words I had to share seemed too simple for such an elaborate occasion. I grew up with nothing, I said, looking out at the faces before me. No money, no connections, no safety net. Everything I have, I built from scratch, with help from strangers who saw something in me that I couldn't always see in myself. I glanced at Callum, standing at the edge of the stage, his expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know him as well as I did. This foundation exists because someone believed that my story didn't have to end in that supply closet. That survival could become something more than just getting by, that the things we endure can become the foundations of the things we build. I paused, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. If you're here today because you're struggling, because you can't see how the story ends, because you're not sure if it's worth continuing, I want you to know something. I leaned into the microphone, speaking directly to every person who had ever felt as lost as I once had. It gets better, not automatically, not easily, not without work and pain and setback, but it gets better, and you're worth the effort it takes to get there. The applause that followed was warm, sustained, genuine, but the sound that mattered most was quieter. Callum's voice in my ear as I stepped off the stage. I love you. I love you too. Simple words, impossible words, the truest words I'd ever spoken. That night, we hosted a small dinner at the estate, just the inner circle, the people who had been with us through everything. Mira raised the first toast. To Nora, who walked into a supply closet and walked out with an empire. I didn't want an empire, I protested. I just wanted to stop crying. Sometimes, Callum said, smiling that rare smile, the best things in life come from the moments we're trying to survive. The conversation flowed easily, full of laughter and shared memories, and the comfortable intimacy of people who had weathered storms together. I looked around the table at these faces, some I'd known for years, others for only months, and felt something I'd spent my entire life searching for: belonging. Not the manufactured belonging of fitting in, of changing yourself to match other people's expectations. Real belonging, the kind that comes from being seen exactly as you are and being welcomed anyway. Later, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Callum and I stood on the balcony overlooking the Aurelian Sound. The water was dark and glittering, the stars brilliant overhead. "There's something I've been waiting to ask you," he said. "If it's about the quarterly projections, David already sent me the numbers." "It's not about work." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside, a ring caught the starlight. Simple, elegant, breathtaking. "Nora Whitfield," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion I could see in his eyes. "You came into my life at a moment when I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. You showed me that I was wrong about almost everything. You taught me that strength doesn't mean control, that vulnerability isn't weakness, that love can be a choice you make every day rather than a feeling that happens to you." He opened the box, held it toward me. "Will you marry me?" I looked at the ring, at him, at the life we'd built together from the wreckage of the lives we'd been living separately. "Yes." The word came out easily, naturally, as if I'd been waiting my whole life to say it. He slipped the ring onto my finger, and it fit perfectly. Not because he'd measured, but because he knew me. He knew my hands, my preferences, my soul. "I have one condition," I said. "Anything. No society wedding, no elaborate display of wealth and power. Just us, the people we love, and promises that mean something." He pulled me close, his arms warm around me, his heartbeat steady against my chest. "Anything you want," he said. "Always." We got married 3 months later in Eleanor's backyard, surrounded by rain-soaked trees and the people who mattered most. I wore a simple dress, beautiful, but nothing like the couture gown I'd worn to that first gala. Callum wore a suit that fit him perfectly, but his eyes never left mine. The vows we exchanged were our own, written in the quiet hours of late nights, refined over conversations that ranged from silly to profound. "I promise," Callum said, holding my hands in his, "to see you as you are, not as the world has tried to make you, to stand beside you in success and failure, to choose you every day for the rest of our lives." "I promise," I replied, my voice thick with emotion, "to trust you with my fears as well as my hopes, to build with you rather than alone, to remember that survival is just the beginning and life is what we make of it, together." When we kissed, the assembled guests cheered. Eleanor cried. Theo looked uncomfortable but pleased. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains. Not a warning, but a benediction. The storm was passing. The future was clear. If you're listening to this story, I want to leave you with one final thought. Life doesn't follow the narratives we plan for it. The moments that define us aren't always the ones we expect. Sometimes the most important things happen in supply closets, in moments of breakdown, in the spaces between what we think we deserve and what we actually receive. I was a secretary, crying in a closet. Now I'm married to a billionaire, running a foundation that helps thousands of young people, living a life I never dared to imagine. Not because I was special, not because I was lucky, because someone saw me when I couldn't see myself, because I was willing to accept help when it was offered, because I chose to believe that my story could have a different ending than the one I'd been told to expect. Your story can too. Wherever you are, whatever you're facing, whatever you've been through, it's not the end. There are supply closet moments waiting for you too. Moments when everything changes. Moments when someone walks through a door and offers you a lifeline you didn't know you needed. Be ready for them. And when they come, be brave enough to reach out and take them. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more stories from Mr. Douglas Tales, where every fall becomes a rise.